She returned to her mother's house to start a new life, but what they found inside revealed a truth that the whole neighborhood had kept quiet about. See how it all ended. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. When Simone turned the key in the rusted lock, the sound echoed through the silence like something waking from a long, uneasy sleep. The door creaked open, and a gust of damp, earthy air rolled out, thick with the smell of rot, old wood, and something green that had grown far beyond control. For a moment she stood there, frozen on the porch, her suitcase at her feet, her husband Dawson a few steps behind her, his hand resting on the railing as he watched her face. The house was exactly as the photographs had promised, and worse. It stood at the edge of a quiet residential street, surrounded by neatly kept homes with clipped lawns and fresh paint. Theirs, however, looked swallowed by the land itself. 2 stories of wood and brick wrapped in vines, its windows hollowed out, its roof sagging under a layer of moss so thick it looked like fur. "This is it," she murmured, almost to herself. "Mom's house." Dawson nodded slowly, his eyes tracing the outline of the place that would be their new beginning. He was the kind of man who saw potential in ruins. Where others saw danger and decay, he saw bones worth saving. "It's got good structure," he said softly. "Just needs someone to care for it again." Simone didn't answer. Her throat had gone dry. She could still remember the last time she'd stood here. It had been 10 years ago, after one of those arguments that lasted too long and left too many words unsaid. Her mother, Estelle, had shouted from the porch, telling her to go live her own life, to stop judging the choices of an old woman. Simone had driven off and never come back. The news of Estelle's death came years later, carried by a lawyer's letter instead of a phone call. And now here she was, standing in front of what remained of that life they had once shared. They spent the first day just exploring. The interior was worse than the outside. Wallpaper peeled from the walls in long, curling strips. The floors were warped by water damage. In the kitchen, the ceiling had partially collapsed, and a patch of mold spread like a bruise above the old refrigerator. The air smelled faintly metallic, as if time itself had rusted here. Yet among the ruin, there were traces of the woman Simone remembered. Her mother's lace curtain still hung in tatters, and the old clock on the wall had stopped at 2:47, though Simone couldn't recall the day or hour it had died. That night, they stayed in a small motel outside town. The next morning, over black coffee and silence, Dawson unfolded a printed list of materials. "If we start with the roof and the plumbing, we can make it livable by winter," he said. Simone stared at the window. The fog outside rolled low across the fields, and she thought of her mother sitting by the same kind of window years ago, watching the same fog and waiting for a call that never came. They moved in slowly, piece by piece. Dawson brought his tools, and Simone brought boxes filled with what was left of her mother's things. A few books, some dishes, and an old jewelry box she hadn't been able to open. As they worked, the neighbors began to take notice. Curtains twitched. Lawnmowers paused mid-cut. People who had lived here for decades peered across the street, as if the house had been a ghost, too long to return among the living. On the 3rd day, a woman knocked on their door. She was in her late 50s, with short gray hair and a nurse's calm smile. "You must be Simone," she said, her voice gentle. "I'm Mabel. I used to live 2 houses down. I looked after your mother for a while." Simone forced a polite smile. "Yes, I've heard your name. Thank you for that." Mabel's eyes drifted past Simone's shoulder into the hallway, where sheets covered the furniture. "I tried to keep the place in shape after Estelle passed, but you know how it is. The city doesn't always make things easy. It's good to see someone taking care of it again." There was a pause too long to be casual. Then Mabel added, If you ever need help advice about the property, the city paperwork, anything at all, I know how those offices work." "Thank you," Simone said, her tone polite but distant. She could feel something guarded behind the woman's kindness, a kind of practiced warmth that never quite reached the eyes. After Mabel left, Dawson looked at her. "You don't trust her," he said simply. "She was too close to my mother," Simone replied. "Closer than I ever was at the end, and I don't even know why." They continued their work. Dawson stripped vines from the outer walls, revealing patches of faded paint and the old wooden beams beneath. Simone cleaned the rooms one by one, uncovering fragments of her mother's life as if excavating memory. In a drawer of the bedroom dresser, she found small paper packets of seeds, labeled in Estelle's handwriting. In the closet, an old wool coat still hung, the scent of lavender faint but unmistakable. And then, while sorting through a box of household papers, she found something that made her stop. It was a small prescription bottle, half full of yellowed pills. The label was dated 6 months before her mother's death, the patient name Estelle, but the prescribing doctor's line was filled in with someone else's handwriting. The name read, Mabel R.N. Her stomach tightened. She had known that Mabel was a nurse, but she hadn't realized she was involved to that degree. Later that evening, while Dawson was repairing a section of the staircase, Simone climbed to the attic. The space was dark and heavy with dust. She swept a corner with her flashlight and noticed a small metal box hidden beneath an old blanket. Inside were several more pill bottles, all labeled with the same handwriting, and a folded letter. The paper had yellowed with age, the ink faint and trembling. "My hands are not steady anymore," it read. "She says it's just the medicine, but I don't think it is. I feel weaker every week. If something happens to me, I need you to know that I tried to tell someone. But no one listens to an old woman who forgets things. If you find this, don't let her have the house." The words blurred before Simone's eyes. She sank to the floor, the letter trembling in her hands. Outside, the wind picked up, pressing against the roof as if the house itself sighed. That night she couldn't sleep. The motel bed felt too clean, too foreign after the day's discoveries. Dawson tried to comfort her, but she couldn't shake the image of her mother sitting alone in that dim attic, writing those words. The next morning, she told him about the pills and the letter. He listened carefully, his brow furrowed. "It's serious," he said. "But before we jump to conclusions, we should talk to someone who knows the law. If Mabel really did something, there'll be a record somewhere." Simone agreed, though her thoughts were already elsewhere. She couldn't stop wondering why no one had ever questioned her mother's decline. Why hadn't the doctors noticed? Why had no one from the city checked on her when the house started to fall apart? The next week was a blur of labor and unease. Dawson repaired the roof, while Simone tackled the interior. Every corner seemed to hold a trace of her mother's final years: unopened mail, old bills, a calendar frozen on the month she had died. There were notes written in shaky cursive, reminders about medication, appointments, names of local officials, and everywhere there was Mabel's name. One afternoon, while clearing the living room, Simone found a small safe behind a section of loose wall paneling. The lock was old, but not secure. Inside, she discovered a stack of papers bound with twine, medical bills, bank statements, and an official-looking document stamped with a notary seal. At the top, it read, "Durable Power of Attorney." Her mother's signature was there, but next to it was Mabel's name, as the agent authorized to make all medical and financial decisions. Simone carried the papers to the kitchen and spread them across the table. Dawson came in from outside, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's that?" he asked. "Proof," she whispered. "She had control over everything. My mother's money, her treatment, even this house. Dawson studied the document carefully. A power of attorney ends when the person dies. Doesn't give ownership of anything. But if Mabel used it to move money or manipulate records before then, she could have done anything, Simone finished. The weight of it settled between them like dust. The air in the kitchen felt heavy again, thick with the same quiet suffocation that had filled the house when they first entered. That evening, Simone took a walk around the neighborhood. The other houses looked peaceful, almost identical with their trimmed hedges and warm lights glowing behind curtains. Yet, as she passed each one, she felt the same quiet distance. People nodded politely, but their smiles were thin. The story of Estelle's house was a legend here, a warning whispered to newcomers about the danger of letting a home fall to ruin. When she returned, she found Mabel standing at the edge of the yard. The older woman waved, as if she had simply been passing by, though Simone doubted it. "I was just checking in," Mabel said sweetly. "I saw your husband fixing the porch. You're doing such a wonderful job. It's nice to see life in this place again." Simone forced a smile. "We're doing what we can." "Your mother loved this house," Mabel said, her tone shifting. "She told me once she didn't want it to go to waste. I think she'd be happy to see you here. You must have sorted out the inheritance by now." The question was too casual, too direct. Simone's pulse quickened. "We're taking care of it," she said shortly. "Everything's legal." Mabel's eyes softened in mock concern. "Of course, dear. I just meant, if you need help navigating the paperwork, I still have a few of her documents. I could bring them over." "I'll let you know," Simone replied. As Mabel walked away, Simone stood watching her figure disappear between the hedges. The evening light cast long shadows across the lawn, and for the first time, Simone felt the full strangeness of her return. This wasn't just about a house. It was about a secret buried under years of silence, one that everyone in this street seemed willing to ignore. That night, Dawson found her sitting at the kitchen table again, staring at the pile of papers. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever this is," he said softly, "we'll find the truth." Simone nodded, though her gaze remained fixed on the darkened window. Outside, the vines rustled in the wind, crawling slowly up the glass, as if reaching for something unseen. Somewhere, deep within the house, a floorboard creaked, a sound too deliberate to be just the shifting of wood. It was as if the house itself was remembering. And beneath that sound, faint but undeniable, was another. The slow, steady drip of water falling from the ceiling onto the kitchen floor, marking the passage of time that had been lost. Simone rose, crossed the room, and stared at the ceiling above her. The stain spreading there looked almost like a handprint. When she turned back to the table, the letter from her mother lay open, the words trembling in the lamplight. "Don't let her have the house." Simone folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket. She no longer felt afraid. She felt something sharper, a quiet, growing certainty that the truth had been waiting here all along, beneath the vines, beneath the dust, beneath the silence of 10 long years. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls again, whispering through the cracks like a voice that refused to die. And for the first time since she had arrived, Simone whispered back. "I'm here, Mom," she said into the dark. "I'm listening." Morning sunlight crept through the grimy windows, casting thin golden lines across the kitchen table where Simone had spread out every piece of paper she found. The house was no longer just an inheritance. Now it was evidence, a web of dates, signatures, and silent betrayals waiting to be untangled. Dawson had left early to buy materials for the porch repair, leaving her alone with the dust and the faint, rhythmic sound of dripping water from the pipe she hadn't yet fixed, The noise kept time with her thoughts, as if the house itself were breathing beside her. She reread the letter again and again, the one her mother had written before her death. Each line felt like a plea whispered across time. If something happens to me, don't let her have the house. The words weighed heavier every time Simone looked around and realized how close Mabel had once been. Her medicine bottles, her handwriting, her name inked across forms of trust and permission, the kind of permission that could kill slowly. By noon, Simone was sitting across from a lawyer named Grant Reed in a cramped office downtown. His desk was neat, his tie perfectly straight, his glasses perched low on his nose. When she explained everything, the letter, the pills, the power of attorney, he listened without interruption. Only once did he lean forward, steepling his fingers. "So your mother gave her neighbor medical authority?" he asked. "Apparently," Simone said, her voice flat. "She must have signed something before she got sick." Grant nodded. A power of attorney allows someone to act on another's behalf. But it becomes void upon death if this woman continued to manage assets or attempted to alter property ownership after your mother passed. That's criminal. However, he added carefully, you'll need hard proof. Simone hesitated. What kind of proof? Financial records, medical documentation, anything showing she used that power for personal gain. You'll also want the official death certificate and the probate file. Without that, we're just talking ghosts. The word ghosts stung. She thanked him, took his card, and left with the faint sense that her mother's shadow had followed her out of the office. Over the next week, she began piecing together fragments of her mother's final months. At the pharmacy, she requested copies of Estelle's prescriptions. The clerk, a tired man with a name tag that read Rick, looked through the records and frowned. "That's odd," he said. "A few of these were picked up by someone named Mabel. Signed right here." He turned the screen so Simone could see the digital signature. Mabel's neat cursive on the receipt. "She said she was taking care of my mother," Simone murmured. Rick shrugged. "It's not unusual for caregivers to pick up prescriptions, but the dosages here, these are heavy sedatives. If she wasn't under direct supervision, that's concerning." Simone left the store with copies of the records, her heart hammering. Back at home, she found Dawson kneeling by the front door, fitting a new lock. He listened quietly as she told him what she'd learned. "It's all starting to fit," he said. "She isolated your mother, kept her sick, then took over everything." Simone nodded. "And everyone just let her." That night, the rain returned. They sat by the window and watched it blur the street lights, streaking down the glass like tears. The other houses glowed softly in the dark, their trimmed yards glistening under the downpour. But their own home still looked wild, the vines slick with water, the porch sagging. Simone thought it was fitting. The house was wearing its grief openly. 2 days later, a letter arrived from the city's Department of Code Enforcement. It stated that the property had been flagged for structural instability and overgrowth, giving Simone 30 days to bring it up to standard or face fines. The paper trembled in her hands. Dawson read over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. "Someone filed a complaint," he said. She didn't have to guess who. That afternoon, she saw Mabel across the street talking to a man in a gray city truck. They stood close, speaking in low voices, occasionally glancing toward Simone's house. When Mabel noticed her watching, she smiled and waved as if greeting an old friend. The gesture sent a chill down Simone's spine. By the end of the week, the inspector arrived, a polite man with a clipboard, who seemed embarrassed to be there. He walked around the property, jotting notes, occasionally muttering about code violations and safety risks. Simone tried to explain that they were already repairing the structure, but he simply shrugged. "I'll have to file the report," he said. "You can appeal, of course." Appeal. Another delay. Another form. Another gate she'd have to unlock with time and patience while Mabel tightened her grip. That night, Dawson brought home pizza and sat beside her at the table, where the piles of documents seemed to multiply. "We need help," he said. "Grant can handle the legal part, but we have to go deeper. Maybe check the property records at the county office." Simone looked up. "You think she tried to transfer ownership?" "If she had the power of attorney, and enough arrogance, yes. Some people think they can outsmart the system when no one's watching." The next morning, they drove downtown again, to the courthouse where the walls smelled faintly of paper and old air conditioning. In the county recorder's office, a clerk helped them search the property file. For a moment, everything seemed ordinary, until the clerk frowned. "That's strange," she said. "There's an application here from last year, labeled Transfer of Interest. It lists Estelle as the grantor, transferring partial rights to a Mabel Harrison." Simone's breath caught. "But my mother was dead last year." The clerk looked apologetic. "Then someone filed it fraudulently. You'll need to speak to the district attorney's office." She printed the document, and Simone stared at the uneven signature at the bottom. Her mother's name was there, but the handwriting was wrong, smoother, younger, practiced. Back home, she spread the paper beside the others. The collection now looked less like inheritance documents and more like a crime scene. She felt her mother's presence in every inch of it, not as comfort, but as insistence. The truth was clawing its way out through every line of ink. Mabel showed up again 2 days later, uninvited, carrying a tin of cookies. "I heard you had some trouble with the city," she said sympathetically. "They can be so unreasonable about old properties. Maybe I could help you file an extension. I have friends in the zoning department." Simone didn't take the cookies. "You've done enough," she said quietly. Mabel's smile faltered just slightly, the cracks showing through the surface of her friendliness. "I beg your pardon. My mother trusted you," Simone said, "and you betrayed that trust." Mabel's eyes hardened for a split second, then softened again. "I think you're tired, dear. Grief can twist things. You shouldn't dwell on the past." "Then why did you forge her signature?" Simone asked. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled at her sides. For a moment, silence filled the space between them. Then Mabel gave a short, dismissive laugh. "That's absurd. You don't know what you're talking about." She turned to leave, but before she reached the gate, she looked back. "Be careful, Simone. Some things are better left buried." The words lingered long after she was gone. That night, Dawson found her in the attic again, staring at the box of medicine bottles. "We have enough to go to the police," he said. Simone shook her head. "Not yet. We need the toxicology report, the handwriting analysis. If we move too soon, she'll claim harassment." Dawson sat beside her on the floor. "Then we do this the right way." They contacted Grant again, who agreed to file a formal complaint. He arranged for a handwriting expert to examine the forged document and a medical consultant to review the prescription records. Weeks passed in a blur of waiting. During that time, the city sent another warning about the property. Mabel's influence was everywhere. She whispered into the right ears, pushed the right buttons. The house stood as both shield and target. One morning, Simone woke to the sound of an engine outside. A dump truck was parked across the street, and Mabel stood beside it, speaking to 2 men in construction vests. "We're just cleaning up the overgrowth," one of them called when Simone came out. "Got a work order from the city." "This is private property," Simone shouted. He hesitated, glancing at Mabel, who gave a small shrug. "Must have been a clerical error," she said sweetly. "Don't make a scene, dear." Simone called the police. By the time an officer arrived, Mabel had vanished. The men apologized and left, but the damage was done. Half of the yard torn up, several old rose bushes uprooted. Simone sank to the porch steps, shaking. Dawson crouched beside her, placing a hand on her back. "She's pushing you," he said. "She wants you to give up." "I won't," Simone whispered. "This house isn't just a house. It's what she took from my mother." 2 weeks later, the phone rang in the middle of the night. It was Grant. "We got the report," he said. "The signatures forged, without question, and the medical consultant found that your mother was given increasing doses of sedatives that could cause heart failure over time. It's enough to open a criminal investigation." Simone felt the air leave her lungs. "What happens now?" "I'll contact the district attorney in the morning. But be careful, Simone. Once she realizes the walls are closing in, she might try something desperate." After he hung up, Simone sat in the dark, listening to the rain tap against the windows. She thought about her mother's voice, the way it used to carry through this house like sunlight. Then she thought about Mabel's voice, steady, practiced, poison, wrapped in concern. When dawn came, she walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, the door frames, the faded photographs. She felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not peace exactly, but strength. Every scar the house bore was a testament to survival. Outside, the vines were finally beginning to wither where Dawson had cleared them. The sun touched the roof for the first time in years, and the moss shone wet and green, like the surface of something alive. Simone stood on the porch and looked out over the quiet street. The battle was no longer invisible. It had roots now, deep and undeniable, stretching into the soil of truth. And though she knew the hardest part was still to come, she also knew her mother's final wish had already begun to take shape. The house was no longer silent. It was speaking through her. As the day warmed, she went back inside, sat at the table, and began to write a statement for the prosecutor. Her handwriting shook, but the words came steady. "My mother did not die of old age. She died because someone made sure she could not fight back. I am here to finish what she started." Outside, the last of the morning fog lifted from the neighborhood. In the distance, a curtain moved in Mabel's window. The woman was still there, watching. But this time, Simone did not look away. The day of the hearing dawned gray and restless, the kind of morning where the air felt heavy with things unsaid. Simone stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the wet yard, where the grass had begun to grow back after Mabel's sabotage. The house, once choked by vines and rot, had started to breathe again. Dawson's repairs had restored color to the porch and shape to the roof, but the soul of the place, the part that had been hollowed by years of silence, still felt haunted. It was as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for the truth to be spoken aloud at last. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass and thought about her mother. All the anger she had carried for years, anger for the arguments, the distance, the lost time, had melted into something quieter now, something almost tender. Grief, perhaps, but also resolve. Estelle had written her a warning, and now Simone had followed it to the end. Dawson entered the kitchen, his tie slightly crooked, his hands calloused and clean. "You ready?" he asked. Simone turned to him, clutching the worn letter she always carried in her pocket. "I don't think you can ever be ready for something like this," she said softly. "But yes." At the courthouse, people whispered when Mabel entered. She wore a dark gray suit, her silver hair swept neatly back, her face calm but pale. Simone watched her take her seat at the defendant's table, flanked by her lawyer, a smooth-talking man in an expensive jacket. Mabel's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a folder, and for a fleeting second, Simone saw not a villain, but a desperate woman, terrified of losing control of the story she had built. The prosecutor, Asha Monroe, was young and focused, her voice clear and sharp as glass. She presented the forged documents first. The power of attorney, the false transfer of ownership, the pharmacy receipts. Then came the toxicology report. The courtroom went still as Asha read the findings allowed levels of sedatives in Estelle's bloodstream consistent with long-term overmedication. Not enough to kill quickly, but enough to weaken. Enough to keep someone docile. Mabel's lawyer objected, arguing that the medicines were prescribed for pain and anxiety, that his client had only followed Estelle's wishes. But when the handwriting expert took the stand and displayed the side-by-side samples, the real signature and the forged one, the difference was unmistakable. Even Mabel's face faltered then, her mouth tightening into a thin line. Through it all, Simone sat still. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She listened, absorbing every word, every tremor of truth, as if each one anchored her back into the world she had nearly lost. By midday, Asha called Simone to the stand. The room blurred slightly as she rose. She told them everything, how she'd found the bottles, the letter, the documents hidden in the wall, how Mabel had smiled as she lied, how the city had nearly condemned the house because of the neighbor's influence. She spoke about her mother's isolation, about how the woman who once hosted neighborhood dinners had vanished from public life, replaced by a fragile shadow no one dared to question. When she finished, there was a silence that felt endless. The judge nodded, made a note, and called for recess. Outside the courtroom, Dawson found her sitting on a bench under a flickering fluorescent light. "You did good," he said quietly. Simone shook her head. "It's not over yet." But in her chest, she felt something shift. For the first time, she wasn't running from her mother's memory. She was standing beside it. The verdict came a week later. The court found Mabel guilty of elder abuse, fraud, and attempted unlawful acquisition of property. The sentencing would take months, but the decision was final. She would never touch Estelle's house again. When the news broke, the story spread through the neighborhood like wind through leaves. For years, the street had kept its silence, pretending not to see what was right in front of them. Now, the silence broke. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid Simone stopped by with apologies and casseroles. Some brought paint, others tools. They helped Dawson lay new boards on the porch, plant flowers along the walkway, scrub the moss from the windows. Slowly, the house changed. The vines came down. The air grew lighter. The rooms filled with the smell of fresh wood and soap. In the evenings, Simone would sit by the window with a cup of tea and watch the golden light spill across the walls. She kept her mother's photograph on the mantel, next to a small vase of wildflowers. The first bloom appeared in spring, bright yellow against the white paint, as if the garden itself had remembered how to live. But healing wasn't just in the house. It was in the people who had once turned away. The city council launched a new review process for caregivers and property transfers involving the elderly. Asha called Simone one afternoon to tell her that her mother's case had inspired broader reforms. She didn't die in vain, the prosecutor said. Simone hung up the phone and looked around. The house was quiet, but not empty. Every creak, every hum of the floorboards felt alive. Sometimes, when she worked in the garden, she thought about Mabel. Not with hatred, but with a strange kind of pity. People like her didn't start out as monsters. They started with envy, with the small, creeping belief that they deserved more. And then they convinced themselves it was justice. Summer came, and the neighborhood bloomed. On weekends, children played in the yards again. Laughter floated through the air, where once there had been whispers. One evening, Dawson hung fairy lights across the porch and invited the neighbors for a small gathering. Simone was nervous, but when people arrived, bringing pies, music, even an old guitar, the unease melted away. As the night deepened, she stood at the edge of the porch, watching the lights reflect off the newly cleaned windows. Inside, the house looked warm and alive. For the first time in a decade, every room was lit. A neighbor raised a glass. "To Estelle," she said softly, "and to Simone, for bringing her home back to life." Simone smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "To truth," she replied. "It took a while, but it found its way." Later, after everyone had gone and the porch lights dimmed, Simone walked through the quiet house. The wooden floor creaked beneath her bare feet. She stopped in the library, the room her mother had loved most. The shelves were freshly painted, and on one stood a framed page from Estelle's journal. "Home isn't a place, it's the people who fight for it." She touched the frame gently. "I fought, Mom," she whispered. "You can rest now." Dawson entered behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You kept your promise," he said. "I think she kept hers, too," Simone murmured. "She wanted me to find the truth." Outside, the first fireflies of the season glowed faintly among the grass. The scent of rain lingered in the air. They stood together for a long time, listening to the soft hum of night. Weeks later, as summer faded, Simone sat on the front steps with her notebook. She began writing again, not legal statements this time, but memories. Stories of her mother's garden, her laugh, the way she used to hum while cooking. The act of writing felt like mending something invisible, sewing pieces of the past back into the present. When she finished the last page, she closed the notebook and looked around. The house no longer felt heavy. The moss that had once covered the walls had vanished, replaced by sunlight and ivy in orderly lines. What had once been a tomb had become a home again. In the evenings, Dawson would read on the porch while Simone watered the plants. Sometimes a breeze would pass through, carrying the scent of lavender, the same scent that had lingered in her mother's coat. Simone liked to imagine it was her mother's way of visiting, a small reminder that love could outlast both cruelty and time. One night, long after Dawson had gone to bed, Simone sat alone in the living room. The house was silent except for the soft ticking of the restored clock. She looked toward the window, where the reflection of the porch light shimmered faintly. In it, she thought she saw movement, just a flicker, like someone walking past the doorway. She didn't feel fear, only calm. She whispered into the stillness, "We did it." The air stirred slightly, and for a moment, the curtains lifted as if in response. Then the house settled again, peaceful and whole. Outside, the moon hung low over the street, silvering the roofs of the neighboring houses. The same houses that had once looked away now stood quietly in solidarity, their windows glowing like silent witnesses. Simone leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. The fight was over. The truth had been spoken, and though the scars would always remain in the wood, in her heart, they no longer hurt. They were proof that she and the house had survived. When dawn came, she rose and opened every window, letting the morning light flood in. The air smelled clean and alive. She brewed coffee, called Dawson down, and together they stepped outside, barefoot on the dewy grass. The street was quiet, but somewhere a bird began to sing. Dawson reached for her hand. "It's beautiful," he said. Simone smiled. "It's home." And as the sunlight warmed the walls that had once been swallowed by moss, she knew that her mother's voice, her warning, and her love had not vanished into silence. They had rooted themselves deep into the foundation, where no one could ever take them again. The house stood still, but no longer forgotten, a living monument to truth, endurance, and the fragile kind of justice that grows slowly, like light finding its way through the cracks. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that stay with you. Watch the next video and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.